When Ruby Callahan walked into Rinaldi Private Bank, still wearing the diner uniform that reeked of coffee and fryer grease from the night before, her frail 5-year-old son and his ever-present asthma inhaler at her side, the branch manager with the slick, gelled hair took one look at her full figure and worn flats, then laughed and told her she'd surely come to the wrong place because they didn't hand out meal coupons here. The 27-year-old woman, orphaned young, abandoned by her husband while she was pregnant, a woman who'd grown used to scornful stares her whole life, quietly slid an inheritance authorization for $10 million onto the counter. Paperwork he couldn't even be bothered to turn a single page of. But what that arrogant manager didn't know was that the silent man in the charcoal-tailored suit, sitting behind the mezzanine glass, the one the whole branch assumed was just some VIP client, was actually Salvatore Rinaldi, the true owner of the entire bank, and he'd seen every second of it. In just a few minutes, when a sudden coughing fit left the little boy unsteady in the middle of the lobby, that powerful man with the faint scar along his jaw would rise from his seat, and what happened next would expose a secret buried for years, topple a man who lived by cruelty, and reach 2 broken hearts that thought they'd run out of hope. Stay until the very end, because this story will make you rethink how we judge a person. If you believe dignity isn't about appearances, hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who needs reminding that kindness is never wasted, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a story that touches the heart like this one. At first, the soft cough was no more than a tiny hiccup, but then it stretched longer, making Eli's thin shoulders tremble and his steps wobble across the cold marble floor of the bank lobby. Ruby spun around, her heart clenching, and dropped to her knees beside her son, digging through her bag for the inhaler. But her hands were shaking so badly that she dropped it, and it rolled across the floor. The crowded bank lobby suddenly froze. A few people turned to look. A few stepped back as though afraid of trouble. And the manager with slicked back hair only stood there, arms crossed, his lips curling into an unpleasant smile, as if this moment only proved everything he had just said. No one moved. No one bent down. There was only the wheezing breath of the 5-year-old boy echoing through the suffocating silence. Then, in the middle of that moment, a tall figure came down from the mezzanine, each step slow but decisive, the hem of his charcoal gray suit jacket shifting lightly with the rhythm of his stride. Salvatore Rinaldi bent down, picked up the inhaler that had rolled beneath a teller counter, wiped it with the neatly folded handkerchief from his breast pocket, then knelt on one knee at the boy's level. He wasn't rushed. He wasn't panicked. He simply placed the inhaler in Eli's hand and said in a low, steady voice, as if he had done this 1,000 times before, that the boy should look at him, take one very slow breath in, then breathe out with him, slowly. It was all right. The boy lifted his large, wet eyes toward the strange man, and as if drawn in by the calm radiating from him, Eli put the inhaler to his mouth and breathed in to the rhythm of the man's hand moving through the air, once, then twice. Salvatore gently helped the boy sit down on the long leather bench against the wall, one hand still resting lightly behind that small back so he wouldn't fall backward, his voice continuing in the same even tone, telling him he was doing very well. Just keep breathing slowly like that. I'm right here. In about 1 minute, Eli's wheezing eased. His little chest no longer rose and fell in frantic bursts, and the boy let out a long breath of relief before resting his head against the back of the bench, his pale cheeks slowly warming with a little color again. Ruby was still kneeling beside him, one arm around her son, one hand pressed to her own chest as though trying to hold back her wildly beating heart, tears spilling from her eyes before she could wipe them away. She looked up at the man who had just saved her child, stumbling through clumsy words of gratitude, saying she didn't know what to say. Thank you. Thank you so much. You didn't have to do that. Salvatore only shook his head slightly, his gaze lingering on the boy's face for 1 second longer than necessary, as if in that instant he was seeing something else, a shadow from somewhere very far away in memory. Then he stood, lightly brushing off the leg of his trousers. The entire bank lobby remained sunk in silence. But now it was a different kind of silence, heavy and ashamed, because all the people who had just stood there watching a child struggle to breathe without moving at all now realized that the only person who had stepped forward to help was the man they hadn't bothered to notice, the man who had sat quietly behind the glass all morning, the manager with the slicked back hair, the man who had just mocked the poor mother and her worn shoes, now stood rooted in place, the contemptuous smile dead on his lips, a vague unease beginning to creep into his eyes as he watched that strange man slowly turn back around, adjust his cuff. For the first time that morning, Salvatore Rinaldi's cold, sharp gaze fixed directly on him. Salvatore walked toward the teller counter where the manager stood, each step unhurried. Yet every fall of his foot seemed to make the air in the lobby thicken a little more. Then he stopped about 1 arm's length from the man and spoke. Not loudly, but clearly enough for everyone in the lobby to hear. "Do you know who I am?" The manager, the man whose nameplate on the desk clearly read Gregory Vance, curled his lip, ready to toss out one of the contemptuous remarks he was so used to using on people he considered beneath him. But before the words could fully form, his gaze caught on the cufflink engraved with 2 intertwined letters on the man's wrist, 2 handwritten R's that he had seen every day on the brass plaque hanging in the main lobby, on every sheet of the bank's letterhead, even on the paycheck he received each month. Vance's face went suddenly white. His lips parted, then closed again like a fish stranded on dry land. And in a voice that had gone thin and broken, he stammered, "Mr. Rinaldi, Mr. Salvatore Rinaldi, I didn't know it was you. If I'd known you were coming today, then." Salvatore didn't let him finish. He simply held out his hand, palm up, and said one single word, "The file." Vance shakily handed over the stack of papers he had been clutching all this time. The papers belonging to the poor mother that he had pushed back toward her as though pushing away a piece of trash. Salvatore took them, turning each page slowly in front of everyone, his eyes moving over every line, every notary stamp, every signature. Then he looked up at the manager and asked in that same frighteningly even voice whether he had reviewed these documents. Vance stammered that of course he had. "Sir," he had checked them very carefully and found several points that needed further verification regarding the source of the money. Salvatore gave a faint nod. Then he lifted the file to the level of Vance's eyes, turned back to the first page, and pointed to the lower corner where the edge of the paper was still smooth and perfectly folded. He said that was strange, because if Vance had truly read through these pages, the edges should have shown marks from his hands, should have curled slightly. But this file was flat and untouched, as though he had decided to reject that woman the very second she walked through the door, before he even knew what was written inside. The entire lobby fell silent. A few employees lowered their heads, and Vance opened his mouth to defend himself, but he couldn't force out a single proper word. Salvatore set the file down on the counter, smoothing it with a motion that was almost gentle, then turned back to the man and said that in this bank, a person's worth isn't measured by the shoes they wear or the clothes on their back, and a man who dares to laugh at a child struggling to breathe in the middle of the lobby doesn't deserve to sit behind any desk that bears his name. He continued, his voice dropping lower, and yet making everyone who heard it shiver even more, that from this moment on, Gregory Vance was suspended from duty. He should gather his belongings and leave within 15 minutes, and Human Resources would contact him later. Vance tried to open his mouth to beg, but Salvatore had already turned away, not bothering to look at him even one more time, as if the man had become something invisible. He walked back toward the leather bench where Ruby was still holding her son, leaned down a little, and this time his voice softened completely, nothing like the icy tone from moments before. He asked the boy if he was feeling better, then turned to the mother and said that if she didn't mind, she and her child were invited into his office, and they would resolve everything properly, exactly the way it should have been resolved from the beginning. Ruby stared at him in confusion, then looked around the bank lobby where people had mocked her only moments earlier, and she tightened her grip on her son's hand, unsteadily rising to her feet and following the strange man who had changed everything in less than 10 minutes. Salvatore's office was at the end of the mezzanine hallway, spacious and quiet, with soft light filtering through thin curtains, and he pulled out chairs for the mother and son, inviting them to sit in the comfortable armchairs across from his desk, then personally poured Eli a glass of warm water before placing Ruby's file on the polished wooden surface. He opened each page once more, this time more slowly and carefully, his finger moving over the seals from the probate court, over the signatures of the notarizing attorney, over the long, endless list of declared assets. Then he looked up and spoke to Ruby in a voice entirely different from the coldness he had shown before. He assured her she had nothing to worry about. Every document here was absolutely valid. The signatures were clear, the notarization was complete, the court had approved it, and there wasn't one legitimate reason to delay this transfer by even a single day. Ruby sat there, her hands clasped together on her lap, listening to those words and almost unable to believe her own ears, because for the past 2 weeks, ever since the lawyer had called to tell her the news, she had prepared herself for hundreds of barriers, for suspicious eyes, for being rejected outright the way things had always happened to someone like her. Salvatore closed the file, leaned back in his chair, and looked at the woman sitting before him with a kind of curiosity even he couldn't explain. Then he asked, his voice gentle but direct, that $10 million was no small amount of money, and from what he had read, the person who had left it to her wasn't a blood relative. So would she mind telling him why a stranger would leave her an entire fortune like that? Ruby lowered her eyes to her calloused hands and stayed silent for a long while, then softly answered that she didn't know how to explain it in a way that would make him believe her, because even now, she still felt as though this were a dream, that she had never expected anything, had never imagined receiving anything in return. She told him, in a hesitant, broken voice, that there had been an old man who often came to the diner where she worked, a lonely old man with no children and no grandchildren, and she had only done the small things anyone should do, pouring him another cup of coffee when the place was quiet, sitting and listening to him talk on late nights when there wasn't a single customer in sight, asking after him on the days when he didn't look well. That was all. Nothing grand at all. She said she hadn't done those things because he had money. The truth was, she hadn't even known whether he had a dime. He dressed simply, left only scattered small tips, and she had treated him kindly only because she knew what loneliness felt like, because she too had lived through stretches of life when there was no one to talk to. Ruby looked up, her eyes slightly red, and added that she had never, not even once, thought that kindness would be repaid with anything, because to her, kindness was never something given for the sake of getting something back. In that silent room, Salvatore Rinaldi sat motionless without speaking for a long while, and something inside his chest, a feeling he had buried and locked away for so many years after losses he never spoke of, suddenly stirred. He had met countless people in his world, people who calculated every dollar, people willing to betray one another for profit, people who did good only to secure something better for themselves, until he had almost forgotten that there still existed in this world a kind of goodness without motive, a kindness given freely without demanding anything in return. And now, sitting across from the woman in the rumpled waitress uniform, the woman who had been mocked and driven away all morning, he realized he was looking at that rare thing itself, bare and honest in a way that made him, a man far too accustomed to trusting no one, fall silent and turn his face toward the window to hide whatever was rising in his eyes. In that quiet moment, Ruby's memory drifted back to the old diner on the edge of the highway, where she had worked the night shift for nearly 4 years, and to the man named Walter Hensley, the man whose long nights sitting beside her beneath the dim yellow lights she now finally understood in full. The old man usually came in sometime after midnight, when the diner was empty and only the low hum of the old refrigerator remained. He always chose the seat in the corner by the window overlooking the empty parking lot, ordered a cup of black coffee with no sugar and a slice of apple pie, then sat there for hours with a distant look in his eyes, as though he were gazing toward someplace very far away. The first time Ruby spoke to him, it was only because she saw him sitting alone on Christmas Eve, when everyone else was with family and he was quietly drinking coffee by himself. So she sat down across from him, poured him another cup, and asked if he was all right. From that night on, Walter told her about his life, that he had once been a marine engineer, that he had spent nearly 40 years drifting across the world's oceans on ships, that he had set foot in harbors she had only ever heard of in books, and that the sea was the greatest love of his life, and the one thing he had never stopped longing for. He told her about the sound of waves striking the side of a ship at dawn, about the smell of salt in the wind, about the nights he stood watch beneath a sky full of stars in the middle of the vast ocean, and every time he spoke of the sea, his cloudy eyes lit up like a boy's. Ruby had never been to the ocean. Not once. But through his stories, she felt as though she could see an entire wide world she had never dared to dream of, and she listened to him not out of a waitress's politeness, but because she truly cherished those stories, and truly cherished the lonely human being sitting in front of her. There were nights when Eli dozed on the long bench behind the counter, and Walter would lower his voice so he wouldn't wake the boy, sometimes even pressing a few coins into Eli's hand and telling Ruby to buy the child something he liked. Then, on one bitterly cold winter night, Walter walked into the diner with an unsteady gait, and the moment he sat down, he suddenly collapsed, one hand clutching his chest, his face turning pale, and Ruby was the one who rushed forward to catch him. called the ambulance, sat beside him the whole way to the hospital, and held his trembling hand tightly until the doctors came. In the days that followed, despite being busy with work shifts and Eli, she still found time to visit him in the hospital, bringing him the coffee he liked instead of the thin, tasteless drink from the cafeteria, and sitting there listening as he continued his stories about the sea until he fell asleep. She did all of it without ever once thinking about who he was or what he had, because to Ruby, Walter was simply a lonely old friend who needed a little human warmth in the final years of his life. And when he passed away quietly on an early spring morning, she cried from the heart, not because she had lost a familiar customer, but because she had lost someone she had truly come to see as family, the only person in many years who had stayed and listened to her, and let her listen to him, without her ever knowing that the man who loved the sea was quietly arranging a future for her and her son. A future she had never dared to imagine. Salvatore turned back from the window, sat down in his chair, and opened a desk drawer to take out another set of documents that the bank's legal department had already prepared according to the will file. He placed it in front of Ruby, and told her there was one more thing the lawyer perhaps hadn't had time to fully explain to her, that Walter Hensley hadn't left her, only that inheritance money. He opened the document, pointed to the carefully prepared lines, and explained that besides the $10 million transferred directly to her, the old man had also created a separate trust fund in Eli's name, a fund set aside entirely for the boy's medical care and education, from now until he reached adulthood. Salvatore added, his voice growing lower, that in the terms, the old man had written very clearly that this fund was to take priority in paying for all medication, treatment, and any special health needs the child might have, as though he had known about Eli's illness, and wanted to make certain the boy would never go without the care he needed. Ruby lifted a hand to cover her mouth, her eyes widening, because she had never told Walter about her son's asthma in detail, and yet somehow that perceptive old man had noticed, had remembered, and had quietly made arrangements for the future of a child who wasn't related to him by blood at all. Then Salvatore drew a yellowed envelope from the file, the handwriting on the outside trembling but careful as it spelled out her name, and he said the lawyer had passed this letter along with the inheritance documents, and instructed that it had to be given directly into her hands. Then he gently pushed the envelope across the desk toward her. Ruby took it with trembling hands, opened the envelope, and in the quiet room she read each line from the man who had passed away, words Walter had written saying that if she was reading this, it meant he was already gone, and he didn't want her to grieve, because he had lived a life longer than he had ever believed he deserved. He wrote that he had spent his whole life drifting across the open sea, and only in old age had he realized he had no one, no wife, no children, no friends, only faraway harbors and waves that now existed only in memory, that he had grown used to becoming an invisible man, someone the world looked at but never truly saw. But then, he continued, there had been a girl at a roadside cafe who sat down beside him one Christmas Eve, when everyone else had turned away from a foolish old man, a girl who had listened to him, asked after him, treated him like a real human being instead of a shadow. And in those dark final years, she had been the only light he had. He wrote that he was leaving everything to her, not out of pity, but out of gratitude, because she had given him something all the money he had gathered in his lifetime could never buy. The feeling of being seen, being cherished, being regarded as a human being. When Ruby read that far, she couldn't hold back anymore. Tears slid down her face and fell onto the yellowed page, her shoulders trembling, and she softly pressed the letter to her chest, as though embracing the old friend she had lost. Salvatore sat silently across from her without saying a word, but in the eyes of that cold man, a gentle and aching light that no one had seen in a very long time was now quietly appearing, because he understood better than anyone what it felt like to become an invisible shadow inside his own life. A few days later, following the appointment to complete the final procedures for the transfer and the establishment of Eli's trust fund, Salvatore suggested meeting the mother and son at one of his restaurants instead of at the bank. A quieter place, with dark wooden tables and warm lights, somewhere he thought Ruby would feel more at ease than in the cold lobby that had once wounded her. Ruby arrived right on time, still dressed simply, but this time in the nicest outfit she owned, and Eli trotted along behind his mother, clutching a drawing pad and a worn box of wax crayons she had bought for him from a second-hand store. While Ruby sat signing the pages that Salvatore and his lawyer patiently explained line by line, Eli climbed onto the chair at the corner of the table, spread out his paper, and began drawing with such serious concentration that his little tongue poked out from the corner of his mouth. The boy drew for a long time, now and then lifting his head to look at the tall man across from him, then lowering it again to color and sketch, until all the papers had been signed and Ruby was folding the file closed. Then Eli slipped down from the chair, walked around the table, and shyly held out his picture to Salvatore. He took the sheet of paper, and on it was a clumsy crayon drawing of 3 people standing side by side. A tall man dressed in dark clothes, a brown-haired woman, and a tiny little boy. But what made Salvatore pause was the face of the tall man in the picture, drawn by the child with both corners of his mouth drooping down and something blue at the corner of one eye. He looked at the drawing for a long while, then asked the boy gently who this was, and Eli answered plainly that it was him, and this was his mom and him. Then the boy pointed to the blue drop at the man's eye and said he had drawn him sad. Salvatore frowned slightly and asked why he thought he was sad, because in front of a 5-year-old child he had kept the same calm expression as always, without a single sign revealing anything. Eli tilted his head and looked at him with the strange seriousness of a child who believed completely in what he saw. Then he pointed to the cup of coffee on the table in front of Salvatore and said that all this time he kept picking up the coffee and putting it back down without drinking even one sip. The coffee had gone completely cold, and he still didn't drink it, just like his mom when she said she wasn't hungry and pushed more food onto his plate. But really she was very hungry. She was only pretending. The whole table fell silent. Ruby stopped midway through, folding the file, and Salvatore sat motionless, his gaze slowly lowering to the cold cup of coffee in his hand, the cup he truly had picked up and put down countless times without taking a single sip, an unconscious habit even he hadn't noticed, a tiny sign of all the things he had always tried to hide deep inside. He looked up at the boy, at the thin child with wide, clear eyes waiting for an answer, and for one moment, the man who had faced the most dangerous people without flinching found himself not knowing what to say before the honest observation of a 5-year-old. At last, Salvatore smiled faintly, a small and rare smile so unfamiliar that even he found it strange. Then he lifted the cold coffee and took a real sip in front of the boy. He said the boy was right. Sometimes he forgot to drink, and thank you for reminding him. Then added that the drawing was very beautiful, and he would keep it. He carefully placed the picture inside the leather notebook he always carried with him, tucking it between the pages as though storing away something precious. And Ruby watched the gesture as a feeling she couldn't quite name rose inside her, because she realized that the cold, powerful man before her, the man this entire city probably feared, had just had the armor he had spent so many years building, stripped away by a 5-year-old child and a cup of cold coffee, and beneath that armor was some deep and bottomless sadness that even Eli, in all his innocence, had already seen. After that day, the meetings between Salvatore and the mother and son gradually became more frequent, no longer only because of documents or procedures, but as though all 3 of them had silently found in one another something they had been missing for a very long time. And one afternoon, when Eli had fallen asleep on the long bench after playing until he was exhausted, Ruby and Salvatore remained beside cups of tea that had gone cold, speaking for the first time, like 2 people truly opening themselves to each other. Ruby told him, in a soft voice that sometimes caught in her throat, that she had never known the faces of her birth parents, that she had grown up moving from one foster home to another, passed from hand to hand like an object no one truly wanted to keep, and that from the time she was very small, she had grown used to people looking at her with judging eyes, calling her a clumsy, chubby child, teasing her about her body until she came to believe she simply wasn't worthy of being loved. She told him that when she grew up, she once thought she had found a home when she met the man who later became her husband, but when she told him she was pregnant with Eli, he left without a word of goodbye, leaving her alone with a belly that grew larger each day and bills she couldn't possibly pay. And from that moment on, it had been only her and her son struggling against the whole world. She said she had become used to being judged by the way she looked, so used to it that on that morning at the bank, when the manager laughed at her, she hadn't even felt surprised, only bitterly familiar with it, because all her life, people had always looked at her and decided who she was before she ever had the chance to open her mouth. Salvatore listened to her in silence, and when she finished, he sat still for a long while, before quietly saying that he understood what it felt like to be looked at by the whole world, and yet never truly seen by anyone, that he too had once had another life, a life he had buried a very long time ago. He didn't tell her much, only said in a low, hoarse voice that many years before, he had once had a family, a wife, and a little daughter, and that he had lost them both in a tragedy he had never been able to forgive himself for, a loss that had made him seal his heart shut and build walls around it so thick that he thought nothing would ever get through again. He said that from that day on, he had lived like a shadow inside his own life, throwing himself into work, into power, into things that kept him busy enough that he no longer had time to feel the pain, until that morning at the bank, when he saw a child struggling to breathe in the lobby and a mother kneeling beside her son, and something inside him, something he thought had died completely, suddenly stirred awake. The two of them sat there in the fading afternoon light, each carrying a wound of their own that they had hidden their whole lives, and for the first time, they felt they could set that wound down in front of another person, without fear of being judged, because the other had also walked through a similar kind of darkness. In the days that followed, without saying a single word, Salvatore began quietly doing things he never boasted about. He contacted the best respiratory specialist in the area, arranged for Eli to be examined and monitored regularly without telling Ruby in advance, and only when she received a call from the clinic, informing her that the appointment had been fully paid for, did she finally understand. He also silently sent to the mother and sons small apartment boxes of good medicine, an air purifier for Eli's damp little room, things she had never dared dream she could afford, all of it without a note, without any sign that he wanted her gratitude or anything in return. And Ruby, who had spent her whole life carrying everything by herself, who had never been cared for by anyone, slowly began to realize that behind that man's frightening coldness was a silent tenderness, a clumsy way of loving from someone who had forgotten how to express it, and her heart softened with each quiet gesture before she could even guard herself against it. Those peaceful weeks passed like a dream Ruby didn't dare believe was real. But then, in those very same days, whispers began slipping into her life from corners she had never expected. The first time was at the diner, when she was wiping down tables at the end of her shift, and two customers sitting in a hidden corner lowered their voices to gossip, not knowing she was standing right behind the partition. One of them said that Rinaldi man wasn't exactly some decent businessman, that people said his whole restaurant and real estate empire had been built on money that wasn't very clean, that he had connections ordinary people were better off staying far away from. The other added, in a voice that was both curious and malicious, that apparently he had recently been circling around some waitress, and who knew what game he was playing, because men like that didn't do kindness for free. Ruby stood frozen behind the partition, the cleaning rag tightening in her hand, and although she tried to tell herself those were only baseless, jealous words from people with nothing better to do, a tiny seed of doubt had been planted inside her, and she couldn't pull it out. In the days that followed, she began noticing more of the things she had once ignored or tried not to think about. The way the people who worked for Salvatore always lowered their heads with respect, mixed with a kind of fear she couldn't quite name. The way doors opened automatically before him wherever he set foot. The way people stepped aside and lowered their voices whenever he passed. An invisible power surrounding him that she had once naively believed came only from money. She remembered the times he had taken a phone call and stepped outside to speak, in a voice that dropped much lower. The moments when his face briefly darkened like clouds passing over it before he could hide it. The little things that now, when pieced together in her mind, suddenly formed a picture that made her heart tighten. Ruby wasn't a fool. She understood that a man who owned a bank, an entire chain of restaurants, and real estate across the city, a man whose mere voice could make an arrogant manager go pale and tremble, surely couldn't be an ordinary man, and his past surely couldn't be as simple as that polished appearance suggested. But what tore her apart wasn't fear for herself. It was fear for Eli, because every time she saw her son run into that man's arms, giggling as Salvatore lifted him up, telling him all kinds of little stories with the clear, trusting affection of a child, she couldn't help asking herself whether she was leading her son into a world where she wouldn't be able to protect him. She had spent her whole life shielding the boy from every hurt, had worked herself to exhaustion so he wouldn't have to go without. And now the thought that she might be letting him grow emotionally attached to a man who himself lived among shadowed things left her unable to sleep in peace. Through long nights, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, her heart torn into two halves. One half whispered that the man who had knelt down to save her son, who had quietly taken care of the boy's medicine without asking for anything, who had hidden her child's drawing in the notebook against his chest, couldn't possibly be a bad man. The other half warned her that she had trusted before and had been abandoned before, that she had no right to gamble with her son's future, just because of the tender weakness of her own heart. And the harder Ruby searched for an answer, the more she realized that perhaps the thing she feared most wasn't Salvatore's past, but the fact that she had begun to care about him more than she allowed herself to, so much that the thought of walking away from him now made her heart ache just as sharply as her fear for her little boy. If the first whispers had been only scattered raindrops, then before long they had turned into an entire storm pouring down over Ruby's head. And at the center of that storm was Gregory Vance, the fired manager who had carried a bitter, poisonous hatred inside him ever since the day he had been humiliated in the bank lobby. Unable to strike back at Salvatore, a man too powerful for him to dare touch, he turned instead toward the weakest link, or so he believed, the poor woman who had unintentionally made him lose everything, and he began his smear campaign on social media with carefully staged posts under a false name. He wrote that a cunning waitress had used every trick she could to steal an $8 million fortune from a lonely old man whose mind was failing, that now she was setting a trap for one of the most powerful and dangerous men in the city, and attached to it were secretly taken photos of Ruby in her rumpled waitress uniform. Photos chosen from the cruelest angles to mock her full figure. Those vicious words spread at a dizzying speed, and before long, the comment section was flooded with brutal lines from nameless people hiding behind screens. Some mocked that a woman like her couldn't possibly have any appeal except greed, while others hurled cruel remarks about her appearance, saying that a wealthy boss like him would have no reason to look twice at some plain, ordinary woman unless she was plotting something. Ruby read those lines late at night after Eli had fallen deeply asleep, and every word felt like a knife cutting into the wound she had carried her entire life, the wound of always being judged by her body before anyone ever bothered to see her heart. And this time it hurt many times more because people weren't only insulting her, they were twisting her kindness toward Walter into a filthy scheme, turning the fragile feelings beginning to grow inside her into a cheap fraud. At the diner, the air changed too. A few coworkers who had once been friendly now looked at her differently. Some made veiled remarks that now that she was rich, she must be about to quit. One regular customer even deliberately asked with a sneer whether it was true she was about to become the wife of some powerful crime boss. And every time that happened, Ruby could only lower her face, tighten her grip on the serving tray in her hands, and force down the humiliation, rising thickly in her throat. She had never done anything wrong. She had only been kind to a lonely old man, and she had only allowed her heart to tremble before a man who had treated her son well, and yet the whole world was pointing at her as though she were a sinner, as though a poor, plump woman had no right to receive kindness, no right to be loved, no right to occupy any place beyond the mold the world had already chosen for her. The pressure kept piling onto her shoulders, growing heavier with each passing day, until there were mornings when she stood before the mirror and almost didn't recognize herself, her eyes dark from sleeplessness, her face hollow from worry, and what frightened her most was the thought that one day those poisonous words would reach Eli's ears, that her son would have to hear people call his mother by those ugly names, would have to grow up beneath the shadow of rumors he had done nothing to cause. When Salvatore found out, he was angrier than Ruby had ever seen him. He said he would make Vance pay, that all it would take was one phone call, and the man would never dare open his mouth again. But that very statement, the way he spoke of his power with a naturalness that chilled her to the bone, only made the doubt inside Ruby grow larger, because it reminded her that his world operated by rules she didn't understand and didn't belong to, a world where every problem could be solved through strength and fear. And that was exactly the world she had sworn she would never allow her son to step into. It was that very sentence from Salvatore, the way he spoke of his power as a weapon that could be raised at any moment, that became the final drop that pushed Ruby toward a decision she knew would break her own heart. And a few days later, she asked to meet him, not at the warm restaurant or in the elegant office, but in a small, nearly empty park near her apartment, where she felt she might have enough courage to say the hardest words. She let Eli play at the slide a short distance away, close enough for her to watch him, but far enough that he couldn't hear the conversation between adults. Then she turned to Salvatore, her hands clenched tightly together, and began speaking in a trembling but steady voice, saying she thought it was time for them to stop. Salvatore froze. He asked if it was because of those poisonous rumors, and if so, he promised he would take care of everything, that he wouldn't let anyone dare touch her again, not even once. But Ruby shook her head, and she said the problem wasn't the rumors. It was the way he had just said he would take care of them. She looked straight into his eyes, her own eyes wet with tears, yet her gaze didn't turn away, and she said she wasn't a fool. She knew who he was. She had heard enough talk, had seen enough of how the world around him worked, and she didn't blame him for his past because everyone had things of their own. But she couldn't, absolutely couldn't, let her son grow up in a world where every problem was solved by fear and power. She said she had spent her whole life bracing herself to protect Eli from every hurt, that she had sworn to herself from the time the boy was still in her womb that she would give him a peaceful life, even if it cost her everything, and that she couldn't swallow that vow just because her heart had accidentally trembled for a man she knew would bring her child into a world full of darkness. Her voice broke as she went on, saying she knew he was a good man. She had seen it in the way he knelt down to save her son, in the way he kept Eli's drawing close to his chest, in the silent ways he protected them without needing anyone to know. And precisely since she believed he was a good man, it hurt her even more to say these words. She wasn't walking away out of a lack of care, but rather because she cared about him too much. So much that she was afraid if she stayed, she would no longer be clear-headed enough to protect her child. Salvatore stood there, the powerful man the whole city feared and respected. And for the first time in his life, he couldn't utter a single word in defense of himself, because he understood that she was right, understood that the very world he had chosen, the power he had built so carefully to cover the pain of losing his family long ago, was now the wall separating him from the only good thing that had touched his heart after all those frozen years. He looked at Ruby, then looked toward the little boy giggling on the slide, the child who had unlocked his deepest secrets with just a single innocent glance. And in that moment he realized he was standing before a crossroads that no amount of money or power could help him cross, a choice that only he himself could make. Ruby called Eli back, quickly wiping her tears before the boy ran over, and when the child innocently waved goodbye to the tall man and asked when he would get to see him again, Ruby could only tighten her grip on her son's small hand and walk away quickly, not daring to turn back, because she knew that if she saw Salvatore's face for even one more second, she wouldn't have the strength to leave. And Salvatore remained standing motionless in the park until the shadows of the mother and son disappeared completely behind the row of trees, his hand unconsciously resting over the leather notebook at the left side of his chest, where he kept the drawing of a child who had drawn him crying. And for the first time in many years, that man understood that if he didn't change, he would forever lose his final chance to become a real human being again. Nearly 2 weeks had passed since that afternoon in the park, 2 weeks in which Ruby lived like a machine, trying to bury herself in work and in caring for Eli so she wouldn't have to think about the aching emptiness inside her, when one morning she received a call from Walter's lawyer, who told her there was a second letter that needed to be placed directly into her hands. The lawyer explained that according to Mr. Hensley's final wishes, this letter had been kept in a separate safe deposit box and was only allowed to be opened and given to her after all the inheritance procedures had been completed, and the money had officially been transferred into her name, a condition the old man had instructed with great care, as though he had known in advance that she would need these words at exactly a certain moment, not from the very beginning. Ruby went to the lawyer's office with an indescribable feeling in her chest, and when she held the second envelope in her hands, marked with that same familiar trembling handwriting, her hands suddenly began to shake, because she had thought she had already said her final goodbye to her old friend, and yet now he was speaking to her once more from the other side of the world. She brought the letter home, waited until Eli had fallen deeply asleep, then sat down beside the small lamp in the quiet apartment and opened it, and Walter's words appeared before her eyes, beginning with the sentence that if she was reading this letter, it meant everything had been arranged, and he hoped she had begun to understand that from now on, her life would be different. He wrote that there was one final thing he wanted to leave her, something he had deliberately kept hidden until this moment, a small house by the sea in Cape May, a house he had bought many years before with the wages he had saved from a lifetime at sea, the house he had always dreamed of returning to in his final days, so that every morning he could wake to the sound of waves and the salt scent of the ocean he loved more than anything. He wrote that he had kept that house for so many years, but had never once dared to live in it, because every time he thought about living alone inside that empty house by the shore, loneliness seemed more terrifying than death itself, and so he kept postponing it year after year until his health no longer allowed it. And only then did he realize that all his life, he had chosen to live in the darkness of fear instead of stepping into the light he had always longed for. Walter wrote that he didn't want her to repeat his mistake, that he had seen in her a warm heart imprisoned behind walls built from judgment and the wounds life had dealt her, and he sincerely hoped that this house by the sea would become the sanctuary, where she could finally embrace a fresh start. He wrote the final lines in handwriting shakier than ever, telling her never to let fear or the judgments of other people decide for her whether she was allowed to be happy, never to hide from the light simply because she had grown too used to the dark, because all of us have the right to choose to step into the light, and that choice is never too late until our final breath. Ruby read those lines again and again, tears falling freely, and she suddenly felt as though Walter were sitting right in front of her, seeing all the way to the bottom of her heart and speaking to her about the very decision she had just made, the decision to walk away from Salvatore out of fear, because of rumors, because she had grown too used to believing that good things weren't meant for someone like her. She realized that the old man's message wasn't only about the house or about his life, but seemed to echo straight into her own situation now. And strangely, it echoed into Salvatore as well, the man who was also hiding in the darkness of his past and his pain, the man who was standing before the same choice between continuing to live like a shadow or having the courage to step into the light. Ruby sat there for a very long time in the night, the letter pressed against her chest, and for the first time since that afternoon in the park, she wondered whether she had truly made the right decision, or whether she was only doing the very thing Walter had warned her about, letting fear choose for her, and whether she and the man she was trying to forget still had any chance left to walk toward the light together. While Ruby sat awake with Walter's letter, not far away, Salvatore Rinaldi was also enduring long, sleepless nights of his own, because that afternoon in the park, the moment he watched the woman and the child fade behind the row of trees, had carved into his heart a question he had spent so many years trying to avoid. What had he built an entire empire of power for, if in the end that very power was the thing that robbed him of the only thing that made him feel he was still human? He remembered Ruby's words, that she couldn't let her son grow up in a world where everything was solved by fear and force, and he realized that was exactly the world he had been living in for so long, a world he had once told himself he had no choice but to choose, after the tragedy that took his wife and child from him, when he believed that only power could keep him from ever being helpless again. But now, sitting alone in his vast, empty office in the middle of the night, he understood that everything he had built was nothing more than a magnificent prison he had locked himself inside, and that the pain he had buried all those years had never truly faded. It had only been covered beneath layers of power and money until a poor woman and a 5-year-old boy accidentally stirred it awake. The next morning, Salvatore did something no one close to him had ever imagined. He summoned all his associates and the heads of every branch of his operations, and announced that he would withdraw completely from every shadowed part of his past, that from now on, everything bearing his name would have to be entirely transparent and legal, with no gray areas left. He began a long and difficult process, having all his assets audited, transferring and shutting down the parts of his business that couldn't stand in the light, working with lawyers to review every contract and every relationship, and accepting the legal consequences that this change might bring, instead of avoiding them, as he was more than capable of doing. It wasn't an easy decision, nor was it one without a price, because stepping away from a world like that meant giving up much of the power and protection it had given him, facing the suspicion of those who had once seen him as their support, and accepting that a transparent path would make him vulnerable in ways he had never had to worry about before. Some people warned him that he was stripping off his own armor with his own hands, that a man in his position couldn't simply walk out of that world without paying a price, but Salvatore answered only with a strange calm, saying he had lived too long in the dark, and it was time he learned how to live in the light, no matter how bright that light was, and no matter how much it exposed him. He spent days working with legal advisors to make certain that every asset he kept was clean and lawful, that if there were any mistakes in the past he needed to answer for, he would face them properly instead of hiding. And throughout that process, for the first time in many years, he felt something like relief slowly spreading through his chest, as though the invisible stones that had weighed him down for so long were being lifted one by one. He understood that doing all of this didn't mean he was certain to win Ruby back, because perhaps she had already decided to leave forever, but what mattered was that he was no longer doing it only for her. He was doing it for himself, because he wanted to become a man his lost little daughter could be proud of, a man Eli could trust, a man worthy of the unconditional kindness he had witnessed in that woman. And when Salvatore Rinaldi looked back on everything, he realized a truth he had misunderstood for his entire life, that real power didn't lie in the ability to make others fear him or solve every problem through force, but in the courage to let all of that go for something greater, for the people he loved, and that the strongest man wasn't the one who held the most, but the one who willingly dared to set down what he had been holding in exchange for the chance to live a decent and honest life. News of Salvatore Rinaldi's transformation didn't spread as loudly as the rumors before it, but it still reached Ruby's ears quietly, piece by piece, through a customer at the diner mentioning that the boss was said to be withdrawing from every shadowed business dealing and making all his assets transparent, through a serious article in the local paper about a powerful businessman voluntarily cooperating with the authorities to clean up every part of his operations, something without precedent. At first, Ruby didn't dare believe it, because too many times in her life she had watched promises dissolve into smoke. But what truly shook her wasn't that grand news. It was one small detail she discovered by chance. The medical center called to say that the boy's advanced specialist treatment for his chronic condition had been fully paid for and carefully arranged, along with a brief message that the person who made the payment didn't wish to be named, and had only instructed that the child's care must continue no matter what happened. Ruby stood silently beside the phone for a long time after that call, because she knew at once who it was, knew that even after she had turned her back and walked away, even when he no longer had any reason to hope she would return, Salvatore was still quietly taking care of her son without asking her to know, without using it as an excuse to pull her back, simply doing it because he truly cared about the boy. And it was that silent act, not any beautiful promise, that told her everything she needed to know about who he really was, because a dishonest man would have displayed his change to buy her return, while he had silently carried responsibility for a child even when no one was watching. She remembered Walter's letter, remembered his warning not to let fear choose for her, not to hide from the light simply because she had grown too used to the dark, and she realized that the man she had walked away from was now courageously reshaping his entire life to stand in the open, while she herself was shrinking back into her own fear. One afternoon, Ruby brought Eli to find Salvatore, and when the boy saw the tall man from a distance, he cried out with joy and rushed into his arms as though those weeks of separation had never happened, while Ruby stood there, her eyes shining with tears, and told him that she had heard everything, had seen everything he had done, and that she was sorry she had once thought she needed to protect her son from him, when the truth was that he had always been protecting both mother and child in the quietest way. She said she wasn't coming back because he had given up power, or because his wealth had become transparent, but because she had seen a man willing to tear down his own armor out of pure integrity, doing what was right without expecting any reward, and that was exactly the kind of man she wanted her son to learn from. Salvatore held her and the boy in his arms, and for the first time in so many years, he let the tears he had held back for too long fall, not tears of suffering, but tears of something finally being healed. After they were reunited, Ruby decided she didn't want her inherited fortune to simply sit untouched in a bank, because she understood better than anyone where that gift had come from. It had come from the unconditional kindness she had given to a lonely old man, and she wanted to turn it into a current that would keep flowing outward instead of stopping with her. She established a charitable foundation bearing Walter Hensley's name, dedicated to helping struggling single mothers and sick children whose families couldn't afford treatment, people standing in the very place where she herself had once stood, people whose entire lives could be changed by one hand reaching out at the right moment. The first family the foundation helped was a young mother whose little child needed surgery she couldn't possibly afford. And when Ruby watched that mother break down sobbing because she knew her child would be saved, Ruby suddenly understood the true meaning of everything that had happened, that Walter's kindness, Salvatore's transformation, and all the wounds she had endured her whole life were now flowing together to create something more beautiful than anything she had ever dared to dream. That summer, the three of them drove together to the small house by the sea in Cape May that Walter had left behind, and when the old door opened to reveal the window looking straight out over the vast ocean, Ruby stood motionless on the threshold, her heart swelling with an emotion she couldn't quite name, because she felt as though she could see the shadow of her old friend in every object, in the yellowed nautical maps hanging on the walls, in the old compass resting on the windowsill, even in the murmuring sound of the waves, the sound he had loved all his life but had never once dared to come here and listen to. Eli, the little boy who once had to keep his asthma inhaler close to him at all times, was now so much stronger after months of careful treatment, his cheeks fuller and rosy, and the moment he saw the beach stretching before him, he cried out with joy and rushed down onto the sand, his small feet skipping after the white-tipped waves, his clear laughter blending with the sea wind until the whole world seemed to brighten. Ruby stood on the porch watching her son, and Salvatore stepped up beside her. The man who had once been cold and distant, now wearing a simple shirt, his hair tousled by the ocean breeze, looking strangely light and peaceful. And as he watched the boy run across the sand, he laughed, a true laugh rising from the deepest part of him, the kind of laughter he probably hadn't allowed himself in many years. Ruby turned to look at him, smiling, and in that moment, she understood that all the suffering, all the judgment, all the wounds she had carried throughout her life had somehow led her to this exact place, to these exact people, to a real home she had never dared believe she deserved. Together, they walked down to the beach, 3 shadows stretching long across the sand beneath the sunset. A family made not by blood but by kindness, forgiveness, and the courage to choose the light. And far beyond them, the sun was slowly sinking toward the horizon, coloring the sea in warm gold and orange, as though Walter himself, from somewhere unseen, was smiling down at the people he had quietly guided toward one another. The story of Ruby, Salvatore, and little Eli reminds us of something simple yet profound, that a person's dignity never lies in appearance, in body shape, or in the balance of a bank account, but in the heart and in the way they treat others, and that we should never rush to judge someone by the way they look, because every person carries a story inside them that we've never known. This story also teaches us that kindness given without expecting anything in return is the most precious and lasting inheritance a person can leave behind in this world, and that no matter how dark the past has been, no matter how long we've been lost in the dark, it's never too late to bravely choose to step into the light and begin again with a kinder and more honest life. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so that together we can spread meaningful stories and listen to even more moving stories every day. How do you feel about Ruby and Salvatore's story? And what part of this story moved you the most? Please leave a comment sharing the feelings from deep within your heart, because we always treasure and listen to every line you share. Thank you for taking the time to listen until the very last moment. I wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, peace, and love, filling each day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next stories.